Hello and welcome back to Dr. Hollowed. In today's video, truckers share their most terrifying nighttime encounters, moments on the road that still haunt them. If you've had a creepy experience while driving at night, comment below to share your story for a chance to be featured in the next video. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. That happened a long time ago to my grandfather's friend. That friend was an experienced trucker, and he was training a younger one by taking him along on his route. So, it's midwinter, and they're driving through a snow desert stretching as far as the eye can see. They're in the middle of nowhere, with not a soul for literally hundreds of kilometers around. I should clarify, the story takes place in the Soviet Union somewhere near Omsk back in the 60s. This means there was practically no traffic because car ownership was very limited at the time, and a trucker could drive for hours without seeing a single car. As they were driving, a powerful blizzard hit, reducing visibility to just about 1 meter. They kept moving until they veered off the road and got stuck in the deep snow. With no passing cars, their situation turned desperate. They had little food, no heating, and no other supplies, and the blizzard could potentially last for days. After 6 hours of what I imagine was very uneasy waiting, fear and panic got the better of the younger, less experienced driver. He insisted they should walk along the road and try to find help. Keep in mind, there were no towns or cities for hundreds of miles around. The older trucker urged him to calm down and wait it out, pointing out that if they walked, they'd likely end up exhausted and exposed to the cold without any shelter. Their best hope, he argued, was to wait for the sky to clear. There wasn't much hope even then, but at least better visibility would give them a slim chance to reach safety. The younger driver, though, grew more nervous, and they began to argue. It escalated to the point where the younger man grabbed a wrench in his frustration. My grandfather's friend had a knife in his hand but decided not to take the risk. Finally, the younger driver opened the door, stepped out into the blinding snow, and stumbled away, knee-deep in snowdrifts. My grandfather's friend stayed in the truck, and the next morning he was rescued by a military team sent out to look for them, guessing they'd likely been stranded in the blizzard. The soldiers came from the trucker's starting point, Point A, and he joined them to head back along the road, leaving the truck behind. The younger driver had set off toward their destination, Point B. After a few kilometers, my grandfather's friend noticed a small black object barely visible against the vast white landscape. His heart stopped, realizing what it might be, and he quickly called to the soldiers to stop the vehicle. When they inspected the spot, they found his young partner, mostly buried in the snow. The black object was his cap, barely noticeable in the deep snow. The young driver was sitting in the snow, frozen and rigid. The older trucker told my grandfather that the cold had captured the young man's expression, a face of profound despair and horror. For the rest of his life, he felt a deep regret for not being able to stop him and for failing to convince him to stay. My dad's a trucker and has been for over 50 years. The most disturbing experience he had happened on a northern Canadian road, involving a terrible accident. A small car, something like a Volkswagen Beetle, had been in a collision, possibly head-on with a large truck. The crash was devastating, and the scene was chaotic. This was around 1 to 2 a.m., and the Department of Highways sent out one worker for the cleanup. When my dad drove by, he saw the worker off to the side, clearly shaken. Concerned, my dad stopped to check on him, and the worker explained what had happened. Seeing how difficult the cleanup was, my dad, always willing to lend a hand, helped him with the work. Even though this was years ago, my dad still has nightmares about that night. About a month ago, I was driving when a truck suddenly sped past me, going at least 60 miles per hour. It quickly crossed into the opposite lane to get ahead of our line of cars before intending to return to our lane. But there was a problem, he couldn't return because our lane was closed up ahead due to road work. This was a narrow, 2-lane road, with each lane meant for opposite directions. For the construction, one lane was completely closed, with plenty of warning signs, traffic cones, and even a traffic cop to direct vehicles. Since only one lane was open, cars were taking turns to pass from either direction to avoid a head-on collision. Our line was completely stopped, with a large red X signal and the cop motioning us to halt so that cars from the opposite direction could go through. But the truck driver didn't seem to notice the road signs or the stopped cars. He kept driving, passing an entire line of vehicles that had stopped. By the time he reached the front, cars from the opposite direction had already started to come toward him. I'd never seen a truck brake so hard in real life before. Thankfully, it was a smaller truck, so he was able to stop quickly and even edge slightly to the side to avoid blocking the road completely. I don't know who was more startled, the truck driver, the oncoming driver he nearly collided with, or the rest of us watching it all unfold. I was driving on a 2-lane road through New Brunswick, Canada, Highway 17 toward Glencoe. Around 3 a.m. I had never driven this road before, and there was nothing around. It was in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. Then, I passed two people in a car on the side of the road who were looking at a flipped car in the ditch. The car's lights were still on, so it looked like the accident had happened recently. The car on the side of the road didn't appear to have any damage. I drove past them about 200 meters, then stopped, reversed back to where they were, and got out to see if they needed help or a phone. I asked if everything was okay, and they responded in French, not uncommon in that part of the country, so I just motioned to my phone as if to ask, "Do you need my phone? Do you need to call someone?" They said something else in French, and I got the feeling they didn't need anything from me. I started walking back to my truck but kept looking back to make sure they seemed all right before leaving. It just felt surreal. After driving for so long without seeing anyone, suddenly, these two guys were just standing there on the roadside, calmly talking and looking at a flipped car, not really doing anything about it. Later that same morning, around 7 a.m., I passed another car that had just hit a moose. Emergency responders were on their way to help the driver, and the moose hadn't survived the impact. As an ex-tow operator, I got a call from my wife at around 1 a.m. She was picking me up when she saw a major accident and called, frantic, saying there was only one car at the scene. Our shop was just a block away, so I rushed over, turned on my emergency lights, and blocked the area for first responders. The accident was on a 6-lane bridge over the thruway. Only one car was there, and its engine was wedged inside the firewall. The entire front of the car was gone. I got out and started talking to a man standing nearby who seemed to be in shock. I asked him if he was hurt. He told me, no. I pulled over because I thought I had a flat tire. I walked around the front to check the passenger's side, and as soon as my foot hit the curb, I heard a loud bang. I turned around, and my car was gone. I asked, "What did you hit?" He replied, "Nothing at all." Confused, I pointed out that the front of a car was wrecked here. He looked around and said, "Nope, that's not my car." At that point, things got even stranger. I looked around the bridge, there wasn't another car in sight, and I could see about a quarter of a mile down the road. A woman then walked up, and the man pointed to her, saying it was her car. She was clearly intoxicated. By the time police and fire crews arrived, the man and I had been looking for the missing car for about 15 minutes. Then, another officer radioed in that he'd found it. Somehow, the car had traveled across 6 lanes and a median, gone down and then up the thruway on ramp, through a fence, over 4 parked cars, and finally into a pole half a mile away. The officer estimated her speed at over 100 miles per hour, and there were no tire marks. If the man had taken even a fraction of a second longer to step onto that curb, he would have been seriously injured. Even though I was off the clock, I stayed to help secure the scene until the accident investigation team arrived. Thankfully, neither the driver nor the man was hurt, though both cars were totaled. Having responded to many accidents as both a volunteer firefighter and tow operator, I've seen my share of serious collisions. But I've never seen anything like this where everyone walked away unharmed. The car was in park, but to go that far, over so many obstacles, and mostly uphill, with such extensive damage, it felt like divine intervention. One night, I was hauling sulfuric acid from the rail siding to a mine site. My shift was intense, usually involving 3 loads a night. It was just the first load, and I got overtaken by a beat-up Commodore packed with passengers. To any country Australian, this sight would be familiar: windows all smashed, only one working headlight, no tail lights, and empty VB cans spilling out. A few kilometers down the road, I saw them stopped off to the side, trying to flag me down. "Hey brother, we got no petrol. Can you give us some?" One of them called out. I told them I was driving a diesel truck and couldn't help. "Nah, brother, that's okay. We only going to Laverton." I apologized but told them it wasn't going to work and drove off, warning other drivers over the radio about their car. On my way back from the first load, I saw them again, trying to get me to stop by jumping out onto the road. That wasn't happening. I pulled on the air horn, and sure enough, they moved off the road well before I got close. I reached the rail siding and called the police and Leonora, who promised to send a car out to check on them. When I headed back for my second load, the police overtook me on the road, so I had no trouble passing the Commodore this time. On my way back from that run, I saw that the police had just left, and the passengers had built a small fire and moved the car well off the road. By the time I started my third load, it was nearly 3 a.m., and I figured this would be a quiet run. But as I got closer, I noticed a dark patch in the middle of my lane. I thought it might be a dead kangaroo and moved over to the opposite lane to avoid it. Then I realized something unbelievable. The dark patch jumped up, ran into my new path, and lay back down in my lane. I moved back to the correct lane, and it jumped up again, running right back to its original spot. I slowed down and hit the air horn, hoping they'd get out of the way. As I swerved slightly to the other lane, a second figure ran out and lay down in that lane too. With 2 obstacles to avoid and no time to stop, I made a decision. I took my foot off the brakes, slammed on the throttle, and aimed for the narrow gap between them, all while laying on the air horn. At the last possible moment, they bailed and ran off into the bush. I kept going, grateful they'd moved. I bet they won't try something like that again. My uncle is a skeptical, stoic truck driver who thinks all superstition is nonsense. At family gatherings, he rarely tells stories, he mostly sits with the older men discussing business. But there was one time he called everyone together to tell a disturbing story from his last trip. He seemed unusually on edge that day. He'd been assigned a long grain delivery to the far north of the country, so he asked a retired friend to come along for company and backup in case anything went wrong. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, they found themselves on a dark road with a soybean field to the left and a dense forest on the right. It was pouring rain, and they were in the middle of nowhere, no villages, towns, or cities anywhere nearby. They knew if the truck broke down, it would be difficult to get help. Suddenly, through the heavy rain and the faint light from the truck's headlights, they spotted the silhouette of someone walking along the edge of the road about 200 meters ahead. They instinctively slowed down to check if the person needed help. After all, no one would be out walking on that road at this hour without good reason. As they got closer, they realized it was a bride wearing a long white wedding dress, carrying her shoes. They slowed down further, lowered the window, and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" But there was no response. She kept walking, staring straight ahead, never looking at them. They tried a few more times, but when she wouldn't respond, they rolled up the window and drove off, feeling uneasy. They even wondered if it could be part of a setup for a robbery. But as they passed her and looked in the rearview mirror, she had disappeared. Here's where the story gets really disturbing. When they reached the nearest village, they stopped at a mini market to grab some brunch and told their story to a baker working there. They'll never forget the horrified look in the man's eyes. After a moment of stunned silence, he explained, "Yesterday, my son went to a friend's wedding. He came home only half an hour later, saying the ceremony was cancelled because neither the bride nor the groom showed up. Just this morning, I heard on the radio that the groom, who is now missing, was suspected of murdering his bride on the day of their wedding, and no one knows why." My grandfather was a truck driver for about 25 to 26 years, so he got pretty good at it. He'd often be gone for days at a time, so he had a sleeper rig with a bed, kitchenette, and other essentials in the back. Bear with me, this detail is important. He would often nap in the bed while waiting in the yard for his haul, leaving the truck on for air conditioning or heat. But this time, he decided to sleep in the driver's seat and dozed off for about 10 or 20 minutes. Now, a little background. My grandfather is 69 years old, though this happened about 4 or 5 years ago. He's a Vietnam veteran with a Purple Heart and has some health conditions from heavy smoking back in the day, plus some PTSD. But he's still as strong as an ox. So back to the story. While he was asleep in his truck, a man, reportedly high on drugs and with multiple warrants out for his arrest, broke into the truck yard. The man wasn't legally allowed to own weapons, but he did, and he started shooting at my grandfather's truck windshield. My grandfather woke up, dove into the back of the truck, and called the cops. After about 10 more rounds, the guy jumped back over the fence and ran into the woods, where he hid until the police found him later. Thankfully, my grandfather was unharmed. It turned out that the man had been living in the woods for about 3 months before this happened. When they caught him, he claimed he'd shot at my grandfather because he thought my grandfather had stolen his spacesuit, which obviously wasn't true. Thankfully, everyone was okay, and the guy went to prison. He has about a year left on his sentence now. My boyfriend and I were driving on an empty country road late at night, around 11 p.m. on a weekend. We were going at the speed limit, 70 kilometers per hour, when a semi-truck caught up behind us, tailgating so closely that we couldn't even see its front license plate. There was maybe 2 meters between us, not safe at all. So, my boyfriend, who was driving, tapped the brakes lightly to flash the brake lights, signaling the semi to back off a bit, perfectly legal here in Germany. The semi did ease up for a moment, but then closed the gap again almost immediately. My boyfriend tapped the brakes again, this time slowing us gently to 60 kilometers per hour. The semi gave a tiny bit more space this time, but still far from safe. We returned to 70 kilometers per hour, hoping we'd soon lose this driver when we turned onto the freeway. After about 2 kilometers, we reached the freeway turnoff. To get onto it, we needed to take a left turn off the country road into the entrance ramp. There was another semi in front of us in the turn lane, one we hadn't noticed before, so it must have been quite a ways ahead of us. The semi turned very slowly, so we slowed down too and followed it into the freeway entrance ramp. The semi behind us followed as well. As we started rounding the curve onto the entrance ramp, the semi in front of us slowed down even more and then came to a complete stop. We had to stop too, of course. For a moment, I was just thinking, great, what's wrong now? Until I noticed the semi behind us had pulled up close, blocking us in. Let me paint you a picture. It's 11 p.m., pitch black, and we're in the middle of nowhere with no other cars around. We're on a curved entrance ramp, with guardrails on either side and dense bushes beyond them. We're in my tiny Chevy Aveo, completely wedged in between two huge semi-trucks, with no way to maneuver around them. And we just had an altercation with the driver behind us. That's when my heart started racing, and I began to wonder how long it would take for police to arrive if we called. Thankfully, my boyfriend had the presence of mind to lock our doors, yay for central locking, because seconds later, the driver of the semi behind us, yes, the tailgater, came stomping up to our car, hammering on the driver's side window and trying to yank the door open. He yelled at my boyfriend to get out and talk about it. Sure thing. Like we were about to jump out into that situation. Meanwhile, I was in full stress mode, fumbling with my phone to stop the navigation and start filming with shaking hands. When I finally managed to get the camera rolling, the angry truck driver had given up and was already stomping back to his truck. A few seconds later, the semi in front of us began moving again, and we were finally free to go and enter the freeway. Honestly, that was one of the scariest moments of my life, and I'm just thankful we live in Germany, where people don't typically carry firearms. My mother and her husband are long-haul truckers, and when I was in my early teens, I went on the road with them for about 3 months. It was a really interesting experience, things like learning how to improvise rest stops, watching my mom read a book while driving, and seeing my stepfather shave while he was behind the wheel. One night, my stepfather and I were sleeping in the back bunk when we heard someone over the CB radio warning drivers to watch out for a big rig going southbound in the northbound lane. My stepfather woke up to tell my mother to be careful, and suddenly he was yelling at her. Turns out she was the one asleep at the wheel, somehow driving down the wrong lane on the freeway. Another unusual experience happened when we were supposedly hauling gun parts into Nevada. We had a 3-car armed escort and were told to deliver the gun parts to a tiny truck stop in the middle of the Nevada desert. When we arrived, the escort team taped up our windows and unloaded the truck themselves. We weren't allowed to leave or even step out of the truck until the unloading was done. My mother and her husband had hauled gun parts before, but never with this level of security, so we speculated that we might actually have been transporting something more sensitive, like missile parts. It was kind of thrilling because we got to bypass way stations and were even allowed to go a bit over the speed limit. It felt like we were doing something super important, though it was probably just sensitive equipment. I was also introduced to the phenomenon of lot lizards, truck stop workers, during that trip, which was another eye-opener. Finally, one night, my mom and I had parked at a Flying J truck stop to grab some food. After eating, we came outside around dusk, and the parking lot was almost empty. Out of nowhere, a huge man stepped out from behind a parked car and started crying. My mom immediately reached into her bag for the .380 she always carried for safety when she left the truck. The man noticed this and quickly said, "Please, ma'am, I'm awfully hungry. I'm so sorry to bother you, I swear, I just need some food. I haven't eaten in days, and I hate to ask, but could you please buy me a burger?" He was genuinely sobbing, and my mom, visibly shaken, told him she didn't have any cash on her. I, however, had $50 in spending money and felt he was sincere, so I gave him the entire $50. He started crying again, thanked us with a "God bless you both," and went straight into the truck stop. My mother told me I was probably being foolish, thinking he'd spend it on drugs, but as we watched him, we saw him go directly to the counter and order what must have been a dozen burgers. That was a good day. I'm a truck driver, and I regularly drive the route between Vancouver and Whitehorse. If you're not familiar, both are in Canada, and it's a long haul, over a day's trip. One time, after about 12 hours of driving, I pulled into a rest stop to grab something to eat and get some sleep. I had a quick meal and went back to my cab to take a nap. As I was trying to fall asleep, I suddenly heard a car door close behind my truck. I glanced in my rearview mirrors and saw 2 people getting out of a car, moving toward my cab as if they were trying not to be noticed. Then, Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that one of them was carrying what looked like a rifle, and the other had a pistol. My first reaction was to get out of there as fast as possible, so I turned on the truck and hit the road. I drove for about 10 minutes before pulling over to call the cops and explain what had happened. About 10 minutes later, a police officer arrived and told me that 2 suspects were in the area who were believed to be on a violent spree and had reportedly killed people. I'll never know for sure, but it's possible those 2 people I saw were the ones they were after. I'm not a truck driver, but I do drive a lot, and I've seen some things. About 25 years ago, I was around 30 miles from home, picking up supplies for a DIY project at Home Depot. Suddenly, I felt my stomach start to churn. I should have just used the restroom there, but I thought I could make it home. With a 30-mile drive ahead, I figured I could tough it out. At first, things were going well. Traffic was moving, and I was keeping a good clench as I drove along the 101 in California. There were 2 or 3 cars ahead of me when, out of nowhere, the car directly in front of me performed what looked like a pit maneuver on the car ahead of it. Due to the speed we were all going, this launched both cars into one of the most spectacular crashes I've ever seen, happening right in front of my eyes. In the shock of seeing the accident, I lost all control, and my stomach reacted on its own. I was going 60 miles per hour when it happened, and unfortunately, I couldn't pull over due to the mess I'd made. I wanted to stop and help those involved in the crash, who likely needed it, but in my state, I had no choice but to keep driving, conflicted between horror at what I'd seen and embarrassment at my own situation. It was one of the most humiliating, humbling experiences of my life, all unfolding within a few surreal minutes. So far, it's the worst thing that's happened to me on the road, and it was just plain awful. I used to do a lot of night driving for work. One night, I was going 50 miles per hour up a hill in rural Maryland around midnight. Out of nowhere, I noticed rapid motion just outside the driver's side window. I glanced over just in time to see a huge buck, perfectly lit, charging right at the car window, his antlers down, and only inches away. The timing nearly gave me a heart attack. I looked just as he hit. This deer was massive, with a huge rack of antlers. His left antler impaled my side mirror and broke it clean off. Both antlers scraped down the side of the car, leaving deep scratches in the paint, and even breaking off points from the force of the impact. The window held, thankfully, but I was left with bloody scrapes along the side of the car, no mirror, and a huge dent where the deer's body had hit the back fender. I pulled over, got out, and saw the buck stand up and trot off, still carrying my mirror housing impaled in his antlers. I've never hit a deer, but that night, one definitely hit me. Another time, I was driving from Flint, Michigan, airport to a small town nearby at around 1 a.m. on a weekday in the winter. It was a long, zigzagging drive across a north-south grid of rural farm roads, lots of left and right turns to keep moving diagonally. Suddenly, I came across a large truck parked across the road, with all its lights removed, not off, but removed. There was nothing to reflect my headlights, and I nearly T-boned it, barely stopping in time, thanks to good brakes and new tires. There were ditches on either side, so going around wasn't an option, and I wasn't about to get out to see if someone was there to move it. So I did a quick J-turn and headed back, choosing an alternate route that the grid system allowed. Already freaked out from nearly crashing into what felt like a setup, I drove on with a good dose of adrenaline. Without cell signal, Google Maps was struggling, so I was winging it to find my way. Eventually, I ended up boxed in by a river and had to backtrack. And what do I see? A truck coming straight at me down the road with no headlights, only those old school roll bar lights with 4 round beams. Convinced I was about to be run down by some Midwestern driver with bad intentions, I immediately turned into the driveway of a nearby farmhouse. And then those guys turned in right behind me. Luckily, the driveway was a loop around a tree, and I whipped around it, shot out the other side, and redlined that rental car until I finally made it to a road that crossed the river. Maybe it was all a coincidence, but I really don't think so. North of Fairbanks, Alaska, I had pulled off the side of the road to check my hazmat load, which I'd picked up just 30 minutes prior. It was January, clear, bitterly cold, and pitch dark. This stretch of highway was pretty desolate, with a long straightaway visible in both directions. The check was uneventful, and in the 10 minutes I was out of the cab, not a single vehicle passed. After finishing up, I rounded the front of my truck to climb back in, and as I grabbed the handle to step up, I heard a strange noise, a mix between a growl and a laugh. The closest thing I can compare it to is how you'd imagine the devil laughing in a movie. I paused, looked around, and chalked it up to my imagination. I got inside, logged my check, and that's when I glanced at the passenger side window and saw 3 bright lights emerging from the tree line about 50 feet away. They moved toward my truck at an incredible speed and then hovered next to the passenger window. I can't tell you how long they stayed there. 5 seconds? 30 seconds? It felt like time just froze. Then, in an instant, they shot to the back of the truck and disappeared completely. As I was putting the truck into gear, still processing what I'd seen, I suddenly heard a couple of loud bangs on my driver's door, like someone was pounding on it. I flipped on my accessory lights as I pulled away, but there was nothing and no one there. To this day, I refuse to stop anywhere near the area where I had that experience. Back in the 80s, my dad would sometimes take on trucking jobs when his union went on strike. One story he told me has always stuck with me. It was a dark night, though I don't remember exactly where or when this happened. He passed away a few years ago, so I can't ask him for more details to fill in the gaps. He was driving a semi, as I mentioned, and he saw something unusual moving alongside him, just on the other side of a fence. It was a bull, a metal bull, as he called it. I assume it must have been reflecting light to look metallic, maybe from his headlights or a full moon, though that part's just a guess. Now, my dad was a pretty fast driver, he even had radar detectors when they first came out, so he was definitely going at a good clip. But the bull kept pace with him, running along that fence line as fast as he was driving. Then, without any hesitation, the fence suddenly veered off to the right, making a sharp turn. The bull instantly followed, making the turn without slowing down at all. That sight really freaked him out, but that's all I know about it. A while back, I asked around on Reddit, and someone mentioned a story about a ghost bull that supposedly haunts some highways. Maybe that's what he saw. I'm not a truck driver, but I do have a story about almost being hit by one, if that counts, lol. One weekend, a friend and I decided to take a 24-plus-hour road trip from Colorado to Oregon, with a detour through Montana. All in the span of 2 days. In the middle of winter. The route took us through mountains most of the way, so we were driving either through snowstorms or on icy roads nearly the entire time. Stupid, I know. When the snow finally cleared, I took over driving since I felt more comfortable on icy roads. It was still only evening, but the road was mostly empty because of the weather. Things were going smoothly, until I spotted a truck parked in the middle of one lane, halfway across a bridge. My nerves started up immediately, but I figured maybe the driver just needed a rest after driving in such rough conditions. But as soon as I entered the bridge, the truck's engine suddenly started up, and it slowly began veering into my lane. It felt like there was nothing I could do. I couldn't switch lanes since the truck was now taking up both, and braking hard on the icy bridge would likely spin us right off the side, with a drop of at least 2,000 feet below. My only option was to speed up, swerve the car, and try to reach the end of the bridge before the truck finished changing lanes. Luckily, I was able to steer into a snow bank at the last second. The weird thing is, the sky was clear, I had my lights on, flashed my brights at the truck as I approached, and even honked when it began changing lanes. But the truck didn't stop or even check to see if I was okay, it just kept going. The fact that it was parked in the middle of a bridge in the first place was strange enough, but everything else? I know he probably wasn't trying to run me off the road, who would risk damaging their truck just to hit two strangers? And maybe he was just tired or distracted. But still. Not cool, man. On a road trip with my dad, we were driving for miles and miles, somewhere between Oregon and Colorado, when we realized we were low on gas. The problem was, we were in the middle of nowhere, and it was nighttime with no lights around. Finally, we saw a small town in the distance and decided to head there, hoping to find a gas station. My dad parked in front of a bar and went inside to ask for directions. Keep in mind, this town was so small it barely felt like it was on the map. When he asked a group of 3 men where the nearest gas station was, they immediately offered him a drink. He declined since he had me in the car and didn't drink anyway, and he quickly realized these guys were way too drunk to help. Luckily, the bar owner overheard and pointed my dad in the right direction. We found the station, but it was just a single pump in the middle of nowhere. At least it worked, so we started filling up. While we were waiting, I got out of the van to stretch, and that's when I noticed something strange, a plane fin sticking out in the parking lot. I walked over to check it out, and sure enough, there was a whole Cessna just parked right there in the lot. I couldn't believe it, it was the last thing I expected to see. A few months ago, 5 friends and I rented a car and took a 10-hour road trip up to New Jersey for a music festival. We decided to leave around 9 p.m. to avoid traffic by driving through the night. After making it through Ohio and parts of West Virginia, we eventually found ourselves in Pennsylvania. Somehow, my buddy's GPS was set to avoid toll roads, so we ended up taking back roads for nearly 50 miles through rural Pennsylvania. Now, since we grew up in Kentucky, back roads don't usually bother us, we're used to them. But as we kept going, we started passing through small, isolated towns. There were plenty of houses but no gas stations, stores, or anything like that. By this time, it was around 2 or 3 a.m., and we started to notice something strange. None of the houses had lights on, not a single kitchen or porch light, and no cars in the driveways either. Now, sure, it was late, but it still felt odd for there not to be a single light on in any of the homes. But the weirdest part? Every house we passed had a candle in each window. For a group of 6 grown men, we were all pretty unsettled, though we couldn't quite put a finger on why. It was just something about the candles in every window that really creeped us out. Does anyone know if there's a meaning behind that? A couple of weeks ago, I was working in London with 2 colleagues. After a late job, we decided to do some urban exploring to pass the time, something we often do when we're working away from home. One of my colleagues suggested visiting an abandoned cemetery he'd heard about, which was deep in the woods. It was late, and we thought it sounded like the perfect, eerie adventure. We arrived at the cemetery, left the lit car park, and made our way into the darkness. Almost immediately, something felt off. While one of my colleagues stepped aside for a moment, a man got out of a Bentley parked nearby and just stood there, hovering around us. It was strange, but eventually, he returned to his car and drove away. Undeterred, we spent the next 40 minutes exploring the cemetery by torchlight. When we'd had enough, we found a long, straight path leading back to the car park, about 500 meters away. That's when we noticed someone walking toward us. We quickly switched off our torches, wanting to see what they were up to, and soon another person appeared, heading from behind us into the dark cemetery, without a torch. Feeling increasingly unsettled, we realized that the 3 of us, big guys all dressed in black, probably looked a bit suspicious. The first person got closer, and we braced ourselves, feeling it was a serious oh no moment. At about 5 meters away, one of my colleagues turned his torch back on, and immediately yelled, "What the hell?" Standing in front of us was a guy dressed in just shorts, with a collar and dog leash. He casually greeted us with a good evening, and that's when we decided it was time to leave. We rushed back to the car park, only to find 6 or 7 cars parked there, each with a single guy sitting inside, looking at their phones. It turns out we had accidentally wandered into a known meeting spot. They were probably all messaging each other about the fresh faces that had wandered into the cemetery.